In 1315, Europe entered a winter that even the oldest people in the village had never heard described before. Temperatures dropped to an estimated 20 degrees. Winds sliced across the fields like thin blades, and the snow didn't just blanket the ground. It buried entire villages under layers as heavy as stone graves. Inside one-room homes where 4 people crowded around a single hearth, the cold didn't always kill with blizzards. Often it worked in silence, like the night the fire died at 3 in the morning, and the child sleeping closest to the edge of the bed never woke up again. The summer before, the harvest had already failed. The granaries had been thinning since autumn, and yet people still had to endure more than 120 days like that. With nights so long, they felt like they were trying to squeeze the breath out of you. What astonishes historians and modern survival experts isn't how brutal the past was, but the fact that medieval peasants had a higher survival rate than many modern communities facing similar winter disasters. They didn't survive by luck, but by a chain of deliberate decisions repeated year after year. If you want to understand what they did differently from us today, let's walk through each stage of that system in the next part. Even in 1315, in a cold, harsh enough to make bones creak, medieval people never walked into winter with a "let's see what happens" mindset. They treated winter like an enemy with a schedule, and to counter it, they built a 3-stage system where missing a single step could cause the entire chain of preparation to collapse. The first stage began on August 1st and ended on Michaelmas, September 29th, the period when every bundle of firewood, every layer of wall, every jar of grain had to be measured without a single day's error. The second stage stretched from October through the end of November, known as the blood season, when every decision about slaughtering and preserving food was a race against temperatures falling faster than the sun itself disappeared. The final stage, from early December to Candlemas on February 2nd, was no longer about preparation, but about survival. Fires were not allowed to die. Food had to be rationed week by week, and the mind had to be kept steady so it wouldn't be swallowed by the darkness. Archaeologists, historians, and modern survival experts call this the Winter Protocol, a system refined across generations at the highest cost, human life. And if you want to understand why this system lasted for hundreds of years, we have to begin with its first principle. In the medieval survival system, calculating firewood was never considered folk wisdom. It was the one equation where being off by a single day could mean someone dying in the night. A 4-person household had to keep the fire burning continuously for 126 freezing days, and modern experiments show the steady consumption rate was around 50 kilos of wood per day to cook and maintain heat. That means by late September, every family needed more than 6,000 kilon of wood already split, dried, and stacked correctly. Fall short by just 50 kilos, and a single 25-degree-C night was enough for an elderly person or a child to never wake up again. But the twist is that many modern people think wood is wood, while medieval villagers understood exactly which types could save or kill them. Oak and beech burned slowly and produced strong heat. They were the woods for long nights. Ash was used when temperatures were moderate, and pine, spruce, or fir were absolutely forbidden in the main hearth. Their high resin content caused heavy spark throwing, and a single ember landing on a thatched roof at midnight could make a family wake up in a sea of fire instead of under a blanket of straw. To avoid disaster, they built massive Holzhausen rings, stacking wood in a circular shape with the bark facing outward and the cut faces inward, so wind could pass through the center, reducing moisture by up to 40% before the first snows fell. What's astonishing is that all these calculations were made by people who had never heard the words thermal energy or combustion efficiency. To them, it was simply a life and death sentence passed down through generations. And if you think this is something more people should know, leave a comment, because who knows, you might be the one keeping this knowledge from being buried like the winters long gone. In those seemingly fragile houses of earthen walls and thatched roofs, medieval people didn't treat patching walls or sealing doors as ordinary repairs. It was the final line of defense between their families, and a cold harsh enough to squeeze the life out of them. Wattle and daub expanded and contracted with the seasons, and by late summer, tiny cracks no wider than a fingernail always appeared. But those very cracks could create a stream of cold air that cut through the straw and blew directly onto the child, sleeping by the edge of the bed. And just a few minutes in, 20 degrees C, was enough for that small body to lose all its warmth. That's why the wall patching mixture was prepared in August. 3 parts clay, 2 parts straw, 1 part animal dung. A ratio that makes many modern people shudder, but produced a durable, low crack, almost perfectly heat-retaining material. Patching started from the roof and worked down toward the base, so gravity would help the layer grip evenly, and every crack was sealed as if they were plugging the entry points of an invisible enemy. Windows were not meant to let light in during winter. Shutters were locked tight, gaps stuffed with moss and straw, and some regions even sealed the windows completely for 3 months, choosing darkness over heat loss. Winter nights tried to pull every bit of warmth from the person sleeping closest to the door, so they covered the floor with thick layers of straw that insulated and absorbed moisture, replacing it whenever the top layer rotted. From the outside, those houses looked crude, but inside they were a battlefield of technique, where every strand of straw, every patched line could determine who lived to see spring. From October to November, when the cold began to tighten but hadn't fully frozen the world, medieval people entered the phase they bluntly called the blood season. It wasn't a ritual, and it wasn't a tradition. It was a life or death equation, decided by butcher knives and outdoor temperatures. A family with 2 pigs kept only one for breeding, while the other had to be processed before. The weather dropped to a point where human hands could no longer move accurately. From the moment the animal collapsed to the moment the final cut of meat was hung in its proper place, they had only 2, at most 3 days, and the entire village had to work together, because no single household could slaughter, salt, smoke, and tend the fire all at once. Lean cuts were salted at a strict 10 to 15% ratio to stop bacteria. Even a slight mistake meant the meat would rot right in the cellar. The fattier pieces were hung in the kitchen for 7 to 10 days of cold smoking, using oak or beech to form a natural protective layer that could keep the meat intact for up to 6 months. Nothing was wasted. Blood was immediately cooked into pudding to be eaten within a few days, and bones were boiled a 2nd and 3rd time. What made this process frightening wasn't the workload, but the thought hanging behind it. Every mistake in the blood season became a winter night with nothing to put into the pottage. And if you ever thought people in the past relied on luck to survive winter, this phase alone should make you rethink that. In the medieval world, where the cold could slip through every wall as if it had a will of its own. Storing food wasn't about saving it for the next season. It was about creating a space where death couldn't step inside. The root cellar, the small chamber dug deep into the earth, was both an engineering structure and a place wrapped in myth, to the point that many villages believed ancestral spirits lived down there to keep the food from spoiling. While modern people call it the soil's thermal stability, medieval villagers only knew that once you dug more than 2 meters down, where the ground was no longer controlled by sun or frost, there was always a silent, steady temperature, untouched by the seasons. They built low ceilings to reduce the amount of air that needed cooling, carved ventilation holes as small as breathing slits, and placed carrots, turnips, and beets into lightly damp sandboxes, as if burying little blocks of stored heat for the future. Meat was hung, never allowed to touch. Even 2 pieces brushing together would trap moisture and mold the entire row. Grain never went into the cellar, but was stored in wax-lined wooden jars placed near, but not against, the hearth. But the most frightening rule was this: the root cellar could only be opened once a week. Open it more often, and the stable cold inside would shatter like a broken spell, making the food spoil twice as fast. Many families believed strange winds could wake the earth's breath and rot the entire store, so they treated the cellar as a sacred place that required absolute respect. It may sound superstitious, but modern tests show that this discipline is exactly what kept food preserved through the whole winter. And if you've ever felt that a medieval root cellar was a blend of engineering and legend, leave a comment. Who knows? Your impression might be part of the knowledge the old world passed down in its own way. When every calculation had been completed, yet winter still dragged on longer than expected, medieval people turned to their final layers of backup, the layers where hope and despair lived together in the same pot. That was pottage. The stew simmered day after day, thin enough to see the bottom of the pot, but still the only meal capable of keeping a body from collapsing. Each time they ladled it out, they only added more water, a few grains, whatever scraps of vegetables remained, and if they were lucky, a bone that had already been boiled 3 times. Adults often skipped their share so the children would have enough strength to breathe through the night, and the silence during those meals was often heavier than the cold outside. When the pottage had nothing left to give, they turned to the forest, not to hunt, but to search. They scraped through layers of snow looking for roots forgotten since autumn, as if searching for gold, gathered the last shriveled rose hips still clinging to branches, and followed squirrel tracks to steal the nuts they had hidden. These were meals no one wanted, but the only reason they could live one more day. And in those brutal moments, medieval people understood a truth we rarely face. Sometimes survival isn't victory. It's simply refusing to fall. If you've ever wondered how long you could endure that kind of hunger, share your thoughts, because your truth might be closer to theirs than you think. In the deepest winter months, medieval people didn't see clothing as garments. It was a second skin that kept them standing on the thin line between life and death. Everything began with linen against the skin, a fabric many modern people consider fragile, but for them it was the net that stopped sweat from turning into a killer. Over that, multiple layers of wool stacked like small walls, trapping warmth inside, creating invisible air pockets that could save a life on a 20-degree C night. Wool cloaks were coated with fat and beeswax to repel water, making snow slide off like it was falling on stone. They wore mittens instead of gloves because they knew separating the fingers let heat escape faster than the wind sweeping across the fields. What makes this system astonishing isn't its complexity, but its cost. Hundreds of hours spent carding wool, spinning yarn, and weaving cloth during summer, when the sun was warm enough that their hands wouldn't go numb. And the twist lies here. Even when wool got soaked, medieval people kept it on. They knew that wet wool still protected them better than dry cotton. Modern science confirms this, but they understood it long ago through their own blood and bone. If this detail surprised you, leave a comment. Who knows, maybe you've underestimated the fabric that kept millions alive. During a 126-day winter, where the darkness grew so thick people believed it had weight, medieval villagers understood that the final enemy wasn't the cold, it was their own minds. So they created a psychological system that many modern survival experts admit is more effective than basic military training. They slept together on a straw bed nearly 2 handspans high, not just to stay warm, but to hear whether someone stopped breathing during the night. That closeness forced even feuding families to lie side by side, because winter left no room for pride. In the morning, they lit the fire like a small political ritual of each household. A strong flame showed the family had prepared well. A weak flame signaled they were running out of resources. The person who kept the fire alive earned more respect in these months than the village chief. When night fell, the community gathered for small feasts, using their scarce food boldly as if to challenge winter itself. A quiet form of show-off that lifted the entire village's spirit. Their daily schedule was strict. Morning fire lighting, midday tool maintenance, afternoon food preparation, evening storytelling, passed down through generations. No one was allowed to give up, because one person's collapse could drag an entire household down with them. What's astonishing is that communities that maintained these rituals had significantly higher winter survival rates than those that abandoned them. And if you ever thought morale couldn't decide life or death, a medieval winter would make you think again. There's a truth many modern people struggle to accept. In a medieval winter, what protected humans wasn't just fire or food, but a mind still clear enough not to lose itself. When darkness stretched to 18 hours a day, and the silence grew so thick it sounded like the breathing of an invisible creature lurking outside the door. Medieval people understood that, if the spirit collapsed, the body would follow immediately. That's why they slept together on thick platforms of straw, not just for warmth, but to know if someone stopped breathing during the night. That closeness wasn't a choice, but a psychological strategy to keep fear from peeling individuals away from the community. Midwinter festivals, which looked like celebrations, were actually rituals against despair. They lit torches, sang old songs, and shared a few precious bites of food, as if telling the darkness they hadn't surrendered. And when the flames dimmed, they told stories. Stories about ancestors, past victories, and the winter that once nearly took the whole village, but failed. These stories weren't entertainment. They were anchors for the mind, keeping it from being swallowed by the suffocating repetition of cold days. What's strange is that groups who kept these habits, sleeping together, small rituals, nightly storytelling, had noticeably higher survival rates than those who let their mental state drift unchecked. Perhaps in 20-degree cold, humans weren't just fighting to keep their bodies warm, but to prove that willpower could outlast the darkness. If you've ever been through a time when your mind mattered as much as your body, leave a comment. And if you want to follow the next stories, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the journey into these forgotten survival secrets.